Welcome and welcome back to our UPR on campus course, Gods and Monsters, Understanding Our Hopes and Fears. If you were here last time, I'm impressed you came back. That was not an easy lecture or discussion. This will be a lot more fun, I hope. Well, I think it's all relevant, so that's not the issue. But cognitive science is slow going. This is Freud and cultural studies, so we'll see how it goes tonight. How to make a monster. Last time we talked about how to make a god. Now, you've probably already seen, if you've looked at the whole series, that what we're doing here at the beginning is theory. So we did religion as anthropomorphism last time, cognitive science, where we looked at how some scholars, some psychologists have suggested that we have kind of God-shaped mental constructs from birth, and that they're just kind of waiting to be filled. They're not really designed for God. They're mostly designed for hope and fear, for survival is what they're designed for. But God concepts fit in those quite nicely. And so we make God in our image in this process because that's our best bet. I mentioned in the discussion post that I didn't emphasize the hope bet last time. I kind of stayed on the fear bet. So for example, if you hear a noise, it's a better bet to think that noise is coming from an agent, and that agent is set out to harm you. It's just the best bet. It's usually wrong, but it's still the best bet. You can also turn that around, and especially on the cultural level and over a longer period, and say, well, it's Pascal. It's my best bet is to think that there is someone or something out there that has my best interest in mind, and I should live accordingly. All right. But there's Freud. We're going to do Freud tonight, so let me just do Freud, and you can mock me for it later. But I still think he's very important. Sure, he was a sexist, and his gender theories are pretty wrong. But he is still used in the practice of psychology and psychotherapy, if only for the talking cure, right? I mean, if you go to a therapist, you're going to talk. And the idea there is for the therapist to see things you can't see. That's Freud, right? That's basic Freud. So, in case you don't know, those are his dates, 1856 to 1939. Austria, escaped to Britain, to London, I think, during the rise of Hitler. Founder of psychoanalysis, his most famous student was Carl Jung, who developed his own psychoanalytic theory, one more amenable to myth and symbol, one less reductively sexual, shall we say. But his story, Freud's story of the unconscious, is still very powerful. Now, it's non-falsifiable. Scientists get really upset with Freud, partly because he called himself a scientist, and he was at the time. But, science is about being able to prove something false. You can't prove this false, so it's not science. But it is a damn good story, and one that has a lot of power today. So he theorized that much of our behavior as humans is driven from things we can't see, something he called the unconscious. And the unconscious is a place of repressed desires. That's a pretty powerful notion. Of course, he went on to talk about the Oedipus Complex, which, is not very palatable, but I still think he's a genius for using a myth to explain a scientific theory, right? To tell a good story. All right, let's get into it. Pardon me if you know Freud and this is pretty remedial for you, but I want us all to be on the same page. Not everyone knows Freud. I mean, you know Freud, and you're supposed to laugh when you hear the name Freud. But let's dig in to his structure of the psyche, which is really powerful, I think. So we have the id. His English translator, it's a German word, his English translator translated it the it. See, already we're in monster territory, right? The it. The id operates according to the pleasure principle. Now, the pleasure principle is very simple. You obtain the most pleasure you can. That includes avoiding pain, right? So it's avoiding pain, maximizing pleasure. The id is biological. The other parts are not. They are psychological and cultural. And so we're all ids because we have these drives. This drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now, if you are an id, you don't care where you get pleasure or how you avoid pain. You just get it. You want what you want, and you want it now. And you will simply take it without thought, literally without thought, because it is a drive. It's an instinctual, biological drive. Remember, we're talking about how to make a monster, right? This is monstrous, to simply want to consume without thought. The ego is what directs the id, because it operates according to the reality principle. So an infant, let's say, is hungry and will stick its thumb in its mouth. Doesn't care. It wants. This looks enough like a nipple. It feels enough like a nipple. I'm in. This is my nipple. The ego eventually develops and says, no, that's not really what you want. You need actual sustenance, not just the symbol of sustenance. And so that's the reality principle. Okay? The ego has a really hard time because the ego's always got this raging animal that it's trying to direct, right, to what it really wants. Now, if you're just pure id and you walk into a restaurant, you're just going to start eating off people's plates and go into the kitchen and eat, and you're just going to consume. The ego is going to say, wait a minute, there's a reality here that you don't want to go back into the kitchen. They'll serve you. They'll actually bring you what you want. Get a credit card or some cash. Then there's the superego that says, hey, you're spending too much money on food. Right? Now, this is me. This is not Freud. I call it the they. So the id is the it. The ego is the I. That's what the Greek word means. Ego, I. And the superego is they. And you know who they are. They're the ones who are always saying, you really want to eat that? Do you think you should do that? Is that a good idea, really? This operates, again, this is me, Freud didn't say this, according to the moral principle. So it's interesting because the id is biological, it's instinctual. The ego is psychological, and the superego is really cultural or societal. And so it comes from outside. That's a very simple presentation of the structure of the psyche. There's some complications. For example, there's a really interesting thing that happens when the superego and the id meet up to beat up on the ego. But we don't want to go there. The drives, Freud said, that we have within us are twofold. He called them Eros and Thanatos for the Greek gods that we're actually going to study next week. we're going to study the birth of the Greek gods. Eros and Thanatos. Eros, you know, desire. Thanatos, death. He said we have the life drive, the libido. We tend to, in popular culture, misuse, as we often do in popular culture, misuse some of these terms. The ego is not egotistical in Freud. The ego is the balance. The ego is the thing that keeps everything in check. It keeps the superego from over-punishing the id. It keeps the id directed toward what it actually needs, the reality principle. So libido is, we associate it with sexuality, and it is, but it's more about, well, life drive. Sure, sex is about life, but anything that promotes life is done through the libido. Whereas Thanatos is the self-destructive aspect of our psyches. It's the death drive. Freud suggested that it was that the death drive was a seeking of the womb through the tomb. Right? So again, very short, and kind of general, but the death drive seeks to avoid the pain of living, the destruction inherent in living, and seeks to retreat to that state of being where everything was provided for you. That is the womb. It's safe, it's your world, you inhabit your world, everything's provided. But that sounds like Genesis, by the way. There's a good reason for that. So we have these two drives, Eros and Thanatos. Freud says in New Lectures on Psychoanalysis, one might compare the relation of the ego to the id with that between a rider and his horse. The horse provides the locomotor energy, and the rider has the prerogative of determining the goal and guiding the movements of his powerful mount towards it. But all too often, in the relations between the ego and the id, we find a picture of the less ideal situation in which the rider is obligated to guide his horse in the direction in which itself wants to go. So you know this, right? It's a great way to describe how you try to move through life every day. You are an animal. You have animal needs. But you are also a human being operating in a culture. So the reality of meeting those needs is very complicated, actually. More than it should be, perhaps. And then he also says about the ego, the poor ego has still a harder time, but it has to serve three harsh masters, and it has to do its best to reconcile the claims and demands of all three. The three tyrants are the external world, the superego, and the id. Again, new introductory lectures. So, we are a mess, is what this means. We are a mess. We have these three aspects of our psyche, which is the Greek word for soul, by the way. Did you know that psychology was the study of the soul? And then in the midst of all that, we have these two drives pushing us toward opposite ends, toward life and toward death. I don't know if you've experienced the death drive, but I think I have, when, it just feels too hard. The reality of the world is too hard, and it just feels like it would be easier to give up, to just let go. And yet, invariably, hopefully, the libido, the life drive comes back and says, no, we must keep going. Life is here, it is abundant, it is hard, but we have to live. Again, I'm articulating that, but these are drives, so you can't really articulate them. It's just things you feel. The monster within us is the id. Nearly every monster you can think of could be described by the id. It is pure desire. What does a zombie want? It wants brains. And that's all it wants. It doesn't care, if you break its legs or shoot it in the chest or anything. You've got to do the double tap to the head or it's just going to keep coming. It is pure desire. And that's terrifying, right? Because there's no regulation. There's no ego there to say, hey, think about this, right? As I said, the id is the first to form of the three. It's biological instead of psychological or cultural, and it operates according to the pleasure principle. So again, think of the monsters you know, and think of them as ids. In fact, there's I think it's Forbidden Planet, where there's, I'm there, thank you. Where they have a scene with the monsters from the id, which is really horrible and wonderful. All right, so that's the psychological element from Freud. There is actually something called monster culture that has been developed largely by medieval scholars, because that's back when we had monsters that were perhaps more real, but not really. They're still real, very real. This is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. His article, Monster Culture, 7 Theses, in a book, Monster Theory, Reading Culture. So you can see we're about monster and culture. So I'm going to take you through these 7 theses. They're a little bit complex, but I think they also are right on. I think you'll recognize the depth and detail of the monsters you know through these 7 theses. By the way, this essay is an introduction to a collected, the book Monster Theory is a collection of essays that Cohen edited, just so you know. First of all, the monster is pure culture. Now stop and think about that. The monster is pure culture. It can be psychological, but it's very quickly cultural because you don't have a private monster, really. I mean, maybe you have a private monster. Maybe you had one as a kid, but it's going to be made like Frankenstein's monster of parts of other monsters. Why? Because you're using symbols. You're using language, if nothing else. Monstrum, that which reveals, warns. It is the same Latin root word as demonstrate. Did you know that? Isn't that interesting? The monster demonstrates, symbolizes something other than itself, of course, because it's a symbol. What does the monster symbolize? What does it demonstrate? The monster cannot and yet must exist. And I'll explain that as we go through, so let me just leave that hanging there. So, number 1. The monster is pure culture. So that means the monster is part of our symbolizing system as a culture, even though you may have your own private monsters. The monster always escapes. Have you noticed that the monster always escapes? Think of monsters as existing deep within the personal and collective or cultural unconscious. They live in these deep chasms. Monsters emerge from the faults, and I mean that as a pun, as both the seismic phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon. The faults, the cracks in culture. Are there cracks in culture? You bet. Because culture can never represent everything we want it to. It always fails. It always succeeds to a point, but culture, and by culture I mean language, I mean religion, I mean myth, I mean philosophy, I mean government, can never be what we idealize. There are always cracks. There are always faults. That's where the monsters live.
Is that what explains demagogues?
Explains what?
Demagogues.
Oh, yes. Yes. Demagogues know these monsters very well. They are the monster,
right? Yeah.
Right? Or at least they use the monster. It's the monster's culture.
Okay.
Right. That's a really good point. They prey upon these cracks, faults in culture, and they dig into them even more, and they pull out other monsters and say, and remind us that our culture is faulty, that we do not live in the world we idealize. Right? So, especially when there are cultural seismic events, when there are culture quakes, look out. Here come the monsters. I feel so odd saying this right now.
You mean like an election?
I mean like an election that has surprising results and perhaps troubling, not perhaps, but troubling results. The monsters emerge. All right, hang with me. These are going to relate to each other. But again, this is cultural study, cultural theory, so it's a little dense. But hang with me. You recognize that scene, right?
I think we're going to need a bigger boat.
That's the one. The monster is a problem. Now, that may sound obvious, but not for the reasons you think it is. Not because he's going to eat your brain, although that's highly symbolic, right? Not because he's going to kill you or consume you. That's a real powerful metaphor for monsters, is to be consumed by them, to disappear into them. Now, the monster is a problem because, remember, the monster is pure culture. So the monster represents a failure, the fault in culture that means that culture doesn't explain everything. It doesn't make everybody happy. It doesn't do what it promised, right? Liberal democracy, begun in the 18th century, was supposed to make us all equal, or at least equal under the law, and to level the playing field. But the monster rejects our categories. It's a symbol of not only the failure, but the rejection of our categories. Because the monster does not fit into our categories. It threatens order. We order our societies in various ways, but the point is order. And in fact, next week when we look at the Theogony and Enuma Elish, we're going to see that all these monsters and all these weird things happening, it's really about chaos and order. The monster is chaos. It rejects our order. It rejects our ordering of ourselves and our culture. It's the liminal. It's the in-between, right? So it's on the edges of culture, or it's beneath culture, right? And it emerges in times of fracture. The monster requires that we rethink what is inside and outside, what is normal and abnormal. Again.
It's actually quite scary, yes.
What's that?
It's actually quite scary.
Yeah. That's what's scary, right? Is the threat of chaos. Is the threat that our order will be dissolved into chaos. That's the only thing it can be dissolved into. And so it destroys everything we thought we knew, right? For example, a zombie should not be walking around like that. That's just not right. You know? He's dead. He shouldn't be walking around, much less wanting my brain. Now, we probably should have talked about Freud and the Uncanny here. In fact, I will a little later. The monster is a symbol of difference. When the monsters emerge, they do not emerge uninterpreted. Remember last time with Wittgenstein, to perceive is to perceive as? So there's no lag in between perception and interpretation. You can have different interpretations, but there's no lag. So as soon as you see a monster, you know that it is one thing or another. It's never just a blank slate. The monster is the concept of difference made flesh. The concept of difference or the other, the not me, the not us, the him, the it, the them, made flesh. That's the terror. It's okay to think about them in your mind and them who live over there, but when them becomes it and is standing in front of you, that's difference made flesh. For example, we talked in the other course about Judaism and the occupation of the Promised Land, which was occupied. There were people there, Canaanites. Listen to this. They're on the edge of entering the Promised Land, and Joshua, I think Moses actually instructs Joshua, to send out some spies, see what's out there, what's it like. So the men go out, they reconnoiter the Promised Land. Here's what they say. The men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we are." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Now the Nephilim are the offspring of when in Genesis chapter 6, when the gods come to earth and have sex with human females. They produce offspring called the Nephilim, or the giants. So, we're about to go into this strange land, different land. Difference is never just difference, it's always other. And other is always either bigger or smaller than it actually is. So, and the question is, do you have power? If you have power, the other is much smaller than you. You can do anything you want. In fact, you can do it because it's other, and you have power. If you don't have power, or you don't think you have power, then the other is much larger than it appears. They might be giants, or they are giants. Sorry, I was quoting a band name. So you see the illustration there. That's from a text that is attributed to a man named Mandeville, who supposedly traveled around the world, but it was it's clearly borrowing from other accounts. But these are the people he saw, right? No heads, faces on their chest. I love the guy with the big foot. What's that about? For medieval Christians, especially in France, there was the song of the brave acts, the chanson des gestes, where Muslims are depicted as monstrous. Why? Because they have power. They have Jerusalem, and we have to go get it. And it parallels the Joshua story exactly, right? Of course, the Jews, probably more than any group of people, have been depicted as monstrous. I was going to say starting with the New Testament, but it actually starts well before that. But the New Testament is kind of the pivot point for the monstrous depiction of Jewry. There's this whole blood curse thing in Matthew, where Pilate, you remember the scene, Pilate is about to execute Jesus, and he tries to release, and wants to release someone, and they say release Barabbas. I can't even say that without hearing Life of Brian in my head. Monty Python. And he says, no, I'll release Jesus. He's not really done anything. And they're like, no, crucify him. His blood be on us and our children. Really? Clearly, someone with an agenda put that in there. And sure enough, it has been used by Christians and even non-Christians to make monstrous Jews, right up until now. Anyway, I don't want to go into too many examples here, but there's also Pliny the Elder, the Roman governor, who suggested that Rome was an empire, and so they were in North Africa, and so they're encountering Africans, and he suggested that the Africans had darker skin because, well, for a couple of reasons. For one, they were the children of Phaeton, whose son had flown too close to the sun and got burnt. Really brilliant deductions here. And that God had just burned them. I know. But what we're talking about here really is the scapegoat mechanism. And this is a Jewish ritual, a major Jewish ritual, Hebrew ritual, I should say, for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, when the Hebrews were traveling in the wilderness. The idea was to take a goat, lay your hands upon him, and transmit your sins for the year, and then send the goat out into the wilderness. That's brilliant, ritually, right? You literally transmit your sins, and they go away. That's a really powerful metaphor, except when it's not a goat, or sometimes even when it is, but especially when it's people. People. So the monster is a symbol of difference. And I think you know how that works. Cohen says this differently. I'm going to say it this way. I think he says the monster dwells at the threshold of becoming or something like that. The monster is a threshold guardian. If you know Joseph Campbell, you know what a threshold guardian is. It's a being that prevents you from coming into the sacred unaware. And will try to turn you back. And the threshold guardian is one of your first tests you have to pass. You have to get past this threshold guardian. Remember that we have lots of threshold guardians, and they're warning signs. So here be dragons, right, on the old maps. There's an article in the Atlantic that said, there's really not that many, or I think it said not any old maps that say this, but there was a globe that said, here be dragons. And meaning, don't go here, right? So the monster is a threshold guardian that says, don't cross this. Of course, there's the monster's pure culture, So there's also reason, perhaps, that some of these maps were drawn to protect sovereign interests in exploration, and of course, colonization, and of course, capitalism, or fledgling capitalism. I forgot. So you shall be like gods, knowing good and evil, from the Genesis story, right? Don't do that. Do whatever you want, but don't eat from this tree. Why? Because if you cross that threshold, you're going to know things. And maybe you don't want to know things. Maybe you don't want to know good and evil. Maybe you don't want to be like us gods. It's plural in the Hebrew text. Maybe you don't want to be like us and know good and evil. Maybe you just want to be in this garden, man. What's wrong with this garden? Just don't do that one thing. But of course we do, because that's how the plot goes. This gets played out in Frankenstein. We're going to have a whole lecture discussion on Frankenstein. But in case you haven't read the novel, it begins and ends where? Does anybody remember?
In the Antarctic.
In the Arctic. Why? Because you're not supposed to be there. It's the early 19th century. You're not supposed to be sailing around up there. You've crossed the threshold. And of course there's a monster there. What did you expect? Polyphemus and the Cyclops in the Odyssey, and we're going to see them again in the Theogony. They are, the Cyclops, they're the monsters. Odysseus has to use his wiles to get away from him as he consumes his men. He eats them. They are monsters because they have not a law to bless them, says Homer. They have not a law to bless them. That sound like the id and the structure of the psyche? You need some sort of ordering. Otherwise, you become a monster. Of course, monsters are, as you can see in this cover from Weird Tales, monsters also represent the transgression of all kinds of boundaries, including sexual boundaries. So, sexuality is one of the most guarded, contested elements of any culture, any society. So it would make sense for monsters to transgress those boundaries, those categories, if monsters are to threaten our ordering of society. In fact, it would be almost required, right? And so you've got Yeats's famous poem, Leda and the Swan, from the story, where Zeus makes himself a swan and comes down and rapes Leda. A god having sex, raping a woman. You get the same, not the same, you get a similar story with the birth of Jesus. Read the story in Luke. Mary is not ecstatic to hear this news. She says she goes away and ponders. And an angel appears to her out of nowhere and says, "Congratulations." And she's a virgin? And she's what? Said she went away and pondered these things for a while. So, in the history of monsters and monster culture, and again, we're going to have a separate discussion on this, the other is usually she. But it's also them. So that's the move, is to make monsters she or them, to make monsters the other gender or just the other. Okay. This is an interesting one. Fear of the monster is a kind of desire. Let me just let Cohen speak for himself here. The linking of monstrosity with the forbidden makes the monster all the more appealing, doesn't it? Because if the monster is the other, if it has emerged from the faults in our culture, certain attraction to that, right? Gotta be. We envy its freedom and perhaps its sublime despair. That's good writing right there. I like that. We envy its freedom. Every time I see a zombie movie, I think, is this just a vehicle for letting us kill other human beings? Right? I mean, because it's okay, we get this ethical pass because it's a zombie, but dude, have you seen The Walking Dead? It is brutal. And don't tell me, because I watched it on Netflix, so I haven't seen whose head got knocked off in the last season. Think about it, and it starts with Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and it goes through all the zombies. Boy, it just seems like just a kind of lust for death on the part of humans, right? And so again, the zombies are projections of us. It's sublime despair. You ever been attracted to sublime despair?
Pleasure, desire, all that.
Oh, cool, all right.
I know you'll like it.
Thank you, I will watch it. The monsters that control it. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's why do we watch monster films? Why do we watch horror films? There's a desire there, right? Sure, we know we're not going to get hurt. It's a safe activity, but still, intellectually, emotionally, we go there. Why would we go there? That makes no sense, except fear of the monster is a kind of desire. And I think we see this in Carnival. So this was one of the most brilliant things the Catholic Church ever did, was create Carnival in the Middle Ages, where, it's right before Lent, right? So yeah, go ahead, have your fun, then we're going to lock you down, right? And so Carnival's magnificent, we need it. Carnival is where order is turned upside down, chaos prevails. It's just utter madness, and it's sanctioned by the Catholic Church. It's Mardi Gras, right? Same thing. Also, Monster Space is free. You're free. You're free of the ego. You're certainly free of the super ego. The monster is becoming. So, we like being. We're less comfortable with becoming. Plato was very uncomfortable with becoming, with change, because that meant for him that it couldn't be immortal. And all he wanted was to find the immortal, the unchanging. The monster is change. It's becoming. We push monsters to the edges of our lands, our interior world, our psychology, our soul, and our culture. But they always come back. Why? Because they're us. Can't get away from us. Us collectively and us individually. They always return. The monster always returns. Because the monster is us. The monster is also the other. And if you were here for the previous series of lectures, we learned early on that the sacred, the definition of the sacred, is the other. Rudolf Otto called it the holy, as in complete, other. Monsters come from the same place as gods, from within and without. And they have sacred knowledge. Because what we think we know is by definition fragmented, inadequate. But they know that we don't know. And so, again, there's the desire. They know things that we don't know. What did Rilke say? I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone. I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone. And they come to us, like Frankenstein's monster, who just says, why? Why have you created me? We'll see this in Frankenstein, but you can draw a line straight from Frankenstein to Blade Runner. When Roy Batty, I hope there's some Blade Runner people. Okay. When Roy Batty, the android robot monster, replicant, comes to his creator, Tyrell, and Tyrell is about to kill him, his creator, just as Frankenstein's monster does. And Tyrell says, what do you want? And he said, more life. Right? More life. Why? To figure out life. They ask us why we have created. What does this all mean? The monstrous, the monster, is a sign, a symbol. It symbolizes what we don't want to see in ourselves and in our culture. Again, this relates to the God, right? So the gods and monsters, they're on a continuum, a human continuum. God symbolizes what we can't do, can't see. Monsters symbolize what we don't want to see about ourselves. We don't want to know who we are. But the monster emerges to tell us that we're hiding things. We project the monster within, again, just as we do gods, according to cognitive science. We project this monster out because something about us loves that process. And again, that's Freud. That's the idea of there's something in here we can't see until we project it out. And we always project in symbols. And so we have to interpret these projected symbols to understand what's in here. Because something about us, like staring at the sun or something, we can't look directly inside. And so we make monsters just as we make gods in our own image. All right, monster culture.